Buddhist meditation is a path of training to gather knowledge, about one's psychological being and the physiological being. It is not a self-hypnosis. One is not trying to go into a trance of unknowing. One is developing a knowing state of consciousness, a complete awareness. And the Buddha's teachings in themselves have four very distinct factors, very distinct purposes. The first of those purposes is to develop knowledge and vision and understanding. The second purpose of the Buddha's teachings is to abandon those things that lead away from knowledge, to give up those things that cause problems in one's life and in one's existence. The third aspect of the Buddha's teachings is to realize freedom from the problems of existence, to experience liberation in one's life, progressively and systematically, until one experiences complete liberation, complete freedom, complete peace and serenity. The next aspect, the fourth aspect of the Buddhist teaching, is to cultivate the path, the way, the practice in one's daily life to obtain that complete freedom, that complete liberation. And I would like this evening to discuss these four aspects of the Buddhist teaching, these four functions of what we call a Dhamma. And what I'd first like to do is maybe explain some of the concepts of what we call a Dhamma, because the Buddha's path is a path of knowledge and understanding. The Buddha did not ask us to accept out of blind faith and belief, but he wanted us to know and realize and understand for ourselves. And as he often said, be an island unto yourself, be a refuge unto yourself. Do not take others as an island, as a refuge, but know and see and realize for yourself. And the thing that we're learning to know and to see is what we call Dhamma. Many of you may have heard this word, but it is important to understand what the word actually means. The word Dhamma comes from Dara, which means to support. So it is that thing which supports everything in the world. Dhamma has many meanings. It means all phenomena, all experiences, all existence, all conditioned realities that can be known. So it means basically everything that can be known and perceived and experienced. It also has another level of meaning, which is truth. Dhamma means truth. That reality, that basic, fundamental, constant quality through life. Dhamma also has the meaning of ethical morality and truth, goodness. Those things which are considered good and wholesome are called Dhammas. Dhamma also can mean the practical path to the realization of truth. So to be practicing Dhamma means to be actually putting a practice into one's daily life, to be fulfilling a goal, to realize that truth. Dhamma can also mean the Buddha's teachings. The Buddha was teaching what he called the Dhamma, those things that led other beings to the realization of truth in their life. And so he was encouraging other people to realize truth. The other aspects of the Buddha's teaching can be summarized in 4 particular teachings which are fundamental to the Buddha's realization. On the night of the Buddha's enlightenment, he saw the Dhamma. And when he saw the Dhamma, he saw 4 things. And he said, these 4 things are comparable to an elephant's footprint. That is, all things can be summarized within these 4 conditions, these 4 realities. And he called those 4 things what are known as the 4 Noble Truths. And I'm sure many of the Buddhists here have heard and understand intellectually the 4 Noble Truths. These are the crux, the core of the Buddha's teachings. And it is what makes one a Buddha. It is what makes one enlightened. But even though we may know the 4 Noble Truths intellectually, the reason we're not enlightened is because we have not penetrated and understood fully the 4 Noble Truths. So it is by fully understanding and penetrating these 4 realities, these 4 truths, that we will realize liberation. And that is the quality that defines an enlightened person, someone who has realized these very 4 things. And these 4 Noble Truths are not a theory, they are not a speculation, they are not a philosophical summarization of existence, but they are a clear understanding and knowing the reality of phenomena which the Buddha saw for himself and realized on the night of his enlightenment. He did not make them up, he did not speculate about them, he did not invent them himself. But when he saw them, then he knew, and then he also taught these 4 Noble Truths for others to also know for themselves. And that is why the Buddhist path is a path of knowledge. And what the Buddha realized was that life was actually basically problematic. That the very nature of existence in itself has difficulties. The very nature of having been born implies problems in that the existence and coming into existence means that one lives, ages, eventually dies, and that in itself is a problem. And he saw that this problematic nature of existence is something to understand. Why is it so? And that was him searching for a cause. Why is there a problem? What is the problem? What is the cause of the problem? And then his mind also looked to see whether there was a solution to the problem of existence as such. Why is this sense of imperfection there? This subtle sense of psychological discontent? This sense of physical peace that the body can never find. It is always moving away from pain, looking for pleasure. And then he turned his mind to finding release from the problem, and then to see whether there was a way to solve the problems. And on the night of his enlightenment, he did see what we call these 4 Noble Truths. And for those people who are not familiar with Buddhist teachings, the 4 Noble Truths can be summarized very similarly to the way a doctor analyzes a disease. The Buddha realized that human existence is problematic, that there was discontentment, both physiological discontentment, that the body must grow old, sick and die, and there was psychological imperfection, that we cannot, even though we experience physical and mental happiness, we cannot always hang on to that. It must change. Therefore, there's this innate insecurity, even in happiness. And when he realized that, he realized what we call this truth of dukkha. The Pali word dukkha means dissatisfaction or suffering. But then he realized on the night of enlightenment that suffering has a cause, and that cause is through the mind that clings, that thirsts, that craves being, craves sensual pleasures of the mind, sensual pleasures of the body, and that craves for non-existence. Then he realized also that there is, by putting an end to craving and clinging in the mind, the desire in the mind for existence to be a certain way, and just allowing it to be according to its own nature, that was an end, that this whole unsatisfactory nature of existence came to an end. But then he also realized that there was a path to putting an end to the unsatisfactory nature of existence. And what I want to speak about is these Four Noble Truths, because the Buddha said that these are this is the core of his teaching. He said, I teach dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. He was not interested in speculation about the beginning of the universe, the ending of the universe, whether the universe was finite or infinite, whether it was eternal or non-so. He was not interested in where human beings came from. He was interested in only the problematic nature of our experience here and now. And that's something we can know, isn't it? We can ask ourselves, everyone in this room can ask themselves, am I experiencing ultimate contentment and ultimate happiness here and now? And that's an answer we can answer for ourselves as well. And so to understand these Four Noble Truths, we actually have to understand this word which is crucial to the Buddhist teaching, which is dukkha. Because what we're trying to do in Buddhism is not establish an ideal about existence, but to face up and actually see the nature of our experience. How is it? What can we know about our experience? Not what we think we would like it to be. We would all like experience to be happy, to be delightful, to be secure. That is what human beings seek. But we have to find a real happiness, a real security, a real perfection, rather than an illusory experience or an illusionary happiness. So what we're developing is an understanding here, to understand experience. And the Buddha defined this word dukkha, that he said experience is dukkha. He explained the word dukkha as meaning many things. Firstly, he said birth is dukkha, that is, birth is unsatisfactory, in that the very nature of being born and coming into the world is a painful experience, both for the child and for the mother. Physically, it is unsatisfactory. It involves pain. Secondly, he said the aging process is unsatisfactory because we all delight in youth, we all delight in health. But when old age starts to set in, the decline of the body, we notice the aches and pains that are associated with that. And that is an imperfect condition. So no ultimate happiness can be found in the nature of an aging body. So the Buddha saw the body like a tree. Its natural condition is to come into existence from the seed, and germinate, grow, then to start to age and decay, rot, and then pass away. Then he said that sickness is dukkha, and that is an obvious form of dissatisfaction, the pain of physical sickness and disease. And we all have health problems, we all have dis-ease. Then he said death is dukkha, and that is an obvious form of the unsatisfactory nature of existence, is that death will occur to all of us. Then he went on to point out psychological forms of dukkha, and he pointed out from the coarsest up to the more refined. He said that sorrow is dukkha, grief, pain, lamentation and despair are dukkha. So these are the coarser forms of dukkha which occur sometimes in our lives. We experience these psychological pains of grief, of despair, of sorrow. When we lose someone we love, for example, there is pain arising. And this is what we call dukkha. But then he went on to expand the meaning of this word to include forms of dissatisfaction which come at different times in our lives, not so occasionally but more frequently, which is, he defined dukkha as getting what one doesn't want as unsatisfactory. When we experience what we don't want to experience, we meet people that we don't want to meet, we associate with things that we don't like, we see things that we don't like, we hear things that we don't like. So not getting what one wants is dukkha. Having association with what is unpleasant is dukkha. And also being separated from what one loves is dukkha, or what one likes is dukkha. This is this unsatisfactoriness, that even when we get what we love and delight in, we have a beautiful relationship, we have a beautiful situation, we're experiencing pleasure, that has to end, and there will be separation at some time. And because of the insecurity in the very nature of pleasure, that in itself is unsatisfactory. And if we're looking for ultimate happiness, ultimate truth, not an illusionary form of truth, an illusionary form of happiness, then we have to reject anything which must change and is insecure. So being separated from what one loves is this occasional dukkha that we have to experience and on a frequent level in our daily lives. And then the Buddha expanded the word of dukkha to a more profound level, to the very nature of being, when he said the 5 aggregates of clinging of a human being is unsatisfactory. And the 5 aggregates of a human being that we can know, which we take to being a being, to being self, what we associate to be me being alive is having a body, experiencing feeling, both pleasant, neutral and painful, of body and mind. We associate those feelings as self, me and mine. Having perceptions through the 5 sense doors. Having thoughts and ideas. And the action of consciousness. We take these, what we call 5 aggregates, as a being. And because these 5 things are in a constant process of change, in a constant process of flux, are never consistent, because of the very momentum of them, what moves and oscillates can never be still, can never be at peace. Therefore, that is unsatisfactory. If we're looking for something which is ultimately still, peaceful, serene, then what is in motion cannot be grasped onto as what is going to lead to peace. And the very aspect of a body is always in a process of motion. You would have noticed that when you're watching the breath. And as we're sitting here, the body is breathing, the heart is pumping, the biological functions are going on. Sometimes we cough, sometimes we sneeze, even though we don't want to. So this process is going on in a state of constant flux, which we have no control over. It is operating under its own momentum. And that motion of the body, which leads to aging and then eventually death, is innately unsatisfactory. No security can really be found in that. So if you think that I am this body and attach strongly to that, then as the body goes through this process of change and then passes away, then one will suffer greatly. So what we're doing in Buddhism is developing this, as I said right at the beginning, an understanding of the nature of existence. What is unstable, impermanent, that is unsatisfactory. And therefore, if one wants to seek security, one has to move to what is permanent, what is secure, not in motion, and turn away from what is in motion. And so these 5 aggregates of being, for example, thoughts, are in constant motion, aren't they? We see our wandering mind when we sit meditation. It's something we can know, it's not something you have to believe. And that is unsatisfying. We want the mind to be peaceful. We want the mind to be still on the breath. We want the mind to be happy and always content. But it goes in this state of constant flux. And therefore that is unsatisfactory. So this word dukkha is very, very profound. That was the Buddha's diagnosis of the characteristic of human existence, that he saw that it is problematic. The Buddha realized that all human beings, and he himself, seek happiness, seek security, seek peace. And in that seeking, in that search for happiness and peace, we're hanging on to things that we think will give us happiness and peace. For example, the body and the mind, thoughts, ideas, relationships, material possessions. But because of their very nature to change, and all things in this world change, we can never find that happiness in the world. So then the Buddha started to seek, well, what is the actual cause of this physiological and psychological dis-ease of the human being, of the human condition? And he realized that there actually is a cause of the dis-ease of the body and mind. That suffering or dukkha arises because of clinging, of craving, of a thirst, where we have a thirst for certain things, certain experiences. And that thirst is a thirst which is seeking happiness. The human being is seeking happiness, so it thirsts after happiness. But sometimes it seeks after happiness in something which is impermanent. And therefore that happiness is illusionary. It is not ultimate stability and peace. And it is this word tanha is the crucial word, the crucial cause that the Buddha saw, which causes the mental suffering in the mind, and the craving and the thirst after the pleasure of the body. For example, we see this very clearly just sitting here. When there's discomfort in the body, we thirst, we crave for comfort to be there in the body. So we move to seek a more comfortable position. So we're actually moving away from what is unsatisfactory, a painful condition in the body, to seek a more comfortable, satisfying, pleasurable posture of the body. So we're moving from dukkha to look for what we call sukha, happiness. We're moving from what is painful to seek what is pleasurable. And it is this constant motion of running away from what is painful and seeking what is pleasure which leads to all this striving in existence. The searching after what is pleasurable, the seeking after, the creating, the building. So seeking pleasure through the body is actually seeking pleasure through the five senses of the body. We're seeking pleasurable sights. We like to look at beautiful things, either in nature or in material things. And we do not like to see unpleasant things. We're seeking pleasant sounds. You notice that in your meditation, someone makes a noise and aversion arises. Yes? There's this dislike there because you want to be peaceful, you want to be still, you don't want to have sound. So the mind is seeking this silence and has this negativity towards the sound. Or one can seek pleasant sounds in beautiful music, for example, the sound of nature, and cling on to that when you hear the sound of a chainsaw, for example. Yeah. Monks often are affected by that. You are also seeking wonderful tastes. This is a great attachment, particularly for lay people, is the pleasure which we experience in food, to seek delicious tastes. Some people establish their whole lives around what they can taste and eat. Good restaurants, for example, good food. So much of our conversation is based around food. And even the thoughts of certain foods bring pleasure, the idea of them bring pleasure to the mind. So we're also seeking pleasure of feeling in the body. But you'll see that this seeking of pleasure and moving away from the painful experiences can never be ultimately satisfying because they always have to change. Therefore, one can never find security in this. And it is the thirst after particular pleasures and the avoidance of what we see as displeasure which leads to the stress, the tension in the mind, the dissatisfaction of the way things are. And so the Buddha defined that this sensual striving for pleasure through the body is the craving which leads on to further existence. It is the energy which perpetuates, because we're seeking pleasure through the body. After death, that energy will seek another body. It will seek another form of expression to cling on to, and therefore one will seek rebirth. It is a logical consequence of seeking more and more pleasure through the body that one will seek, after the ending of this body, another form, another body, another space for the mind to operate in, and seek more pleasure through that body. The other aspect of thirst and craving is the thirst for being alive. The survival instinct is very, very strong. And it's not until we get a very strong fright that we actually realize how powerful that survival instinct is. And we see the rush of adrenaline, the fright-flight syndrome working. And that's desire to be. The desire to be also implies the desire to create. So we become a person, we become a profession, we become an individual, and we express who we are through the body, for example, don't we? Or we dress in a certain way, we style our hair in a certain way, as an expression of our being, of our independence, of our individuality. And we also seek fame, we seek happiness, we seek gain as an expression of being in the world. And we measure other beings according to, say, the conventional criteria. For example, we ask, what job do you do? And if they say, well, I'm a street sweeper, then we tend to pass judgment on that, either consciously or subconsciously. If they say they're a doctor, then we pass some bias of the mind or some prejudgment onto that we expect certain things from those professions or those people. So we see this craving for being is there, which leads on to more being. Then there is another form of thirst, which the Buddha talked about, which is the cause for this dissatisfaction in the mind. And that is the craving for non-being, to not to have. And the craving for non-being is when we get sick of experiencing the pain of the world. For example, you see that when people are in states of depression or despair, then the craving for non-being becomes so strong that they want to cease to exist. Suicide is an expression of non-being, not wanting to be. And even self-destructive behavior, for example, you see that sometimes excessive drug taking, excessive alcohol, is a form of self-destruction because one doesn't want to exist. One wants to be somebody else. One wants to be happier, but one is doing that because one is not content with the way one is now. So this craving for non-being, I don't want to be the way I am, I don't want to be the person I take myself to be, is an expression of this vipabhava tanha, the craving for non-existence. Or even just the desire to crash out and not to experience life anymore and just stay in bed, is this subtle form of the craving for non-being. People who can't get out of bed in the morning and have a very subtle sense of, I cannot face life, I don't have the energy, the zest, the joy to look forward to a next day. So that will roll over because they do not want to face existence. This is a subtle form of craving to not exist, to not experience, looking at things in a very depressed and negative way. So this is a craving, a thirst to not have, to not experience. And it is very important that we understand this. And that is why the Buddha said, and I mentioned right at the beginning of my talk, that the Buddhist path is a path of knowledge. Firstly, we have to know our experience of existence, what it is. And also, then we have to abandon those causes, those conditions which lead to dissatisfaction, that lead to pain, psychological pain in the mind. And the thing that we have to abandon is this craving. And the Buddha said that if one abandons craving, then one will realize enlightenment. And that was the next of the Four Noble Truths that he realized. That he became enlightened by abandoning the craving for pleasure and the running away from displeasure. And just allow things to be, allow things to arise and pass away according to their natural phenomena. And that is why Dhamma is often called nature, compared to nature, just knowing things the way they are, allowing things to arise. If it's pleasant, that's okay. If it's not pleasant, that's okay. If one likes it, that's okay. If one doesn't like it, that's okay. It's this non-preference of mind, just to allow things to be in the present moment. That leads to contentment. When we allow things to be in the present moment, there's contentment there, and contentment leads to peace. But this craving is very profound, as I just mentioned. It leads to the very sense of the survival of the being. It is the thing that drives us on to future birth. And it is not abandoned easily. What we're doing is then having to cultivate a path to abandon craving. And that was the other realization that the Buddha had, that he realized the path to the putting the end of craving, to putting the end of craving. That is what he called the Noble Eightfold Path. And the reason it's called noble is because, firstly, it is the noble ones, what we call the Aryas, that have actually realized this path. In Buddhism, there are two forms of beings in the world. There are the unenlightened beings, and there are the enlightened beings. And there is a big distinction. And what makes one an enlightened being, or on some level of enlightenment, and there are 4 levels of enlightenment, is the level of comprehension of these very 4 noble truths that I'm talking about. That is, the degree that one has realized and penetrated dissatisfaction and its cause, one has abandoned its cause. If one has abandoned craving a little, then one will be enlightened a little. This is how Ajahn Chah used to explain it, my teacher. If one abandons craving a lot, one will be enlightened a lot. If one abandons craving completely, one will be enlightened completely. And so the abandonment of craving is what leads to enlightenment. It is the cultivation of the path which leads to liberation and Nibbana. And to cultivate this path that leads to enlightenment, one needs certain noble qualities. That is another reason why it's called a Noble Eightfold Path, because one has to ennoble the mind, make the mind rise up to certain qualities which we respect as wise and skillful and good. And it leads to the result, which is enlightenment, which is a noble realization. And that is why it is called the Noble Eightfold Path. And this Eightfold Path is, firstly, the development of right view or right understanding. Firstly, that there is dissatisfaction in my mind at the present moment. I am not ultimately content. And then asking oneself, well, why? What is the cause? What do I want? What do I reject? What am I thirsting after in life? What am I rejecting in life? And then, as one lets go of that cause of dissatisfaction and discontentment, then one is inclining towards enlightenment, gradually, systematically. And one is seeing that this is a path which leads to freedom. So this first view, firstly of the problem, then understanding the cause of that problem, then seeing that there is an end to the problem, and then finding a means to overcome the problem of existence, is the pathway, the view of the path to liberation, to ennoblement of the mind. Then the next aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path which the Buddha taught was that there are certain forms of thought which should be developed in the mind, and certain forms of thought which should be abandoned in the mind. The forms of thought which should be developed in the mind are those forms of thought which are based in loving kindness, are based in compassion, are based in renunciation, giving, generosity. And those forms of thought which should be abandoned and overcome in the mind are those forms of thought which lead to our dissatisfaction, those forms of anger, aversion, negativity, aggressiveness, competitiveness. Forms of thought of cruelty, taking advantage, exploitive behaviour, selfish behaviour, on its most gross level and on its most subtle levels. And forms of thought which is based in selfishness of what can I get, what is best for me. This sense of being the centre of the universe and not saying to oneself, how can I be a blessing to others, a blessing to the world? These are the forms of thought that one should be abandoning, and the opposite, thoughts of loving kindness, compassion and goodwill, generosity, are forms of thought that one should be cultivating. And the Buddha said this inclines to Nibbana, this inclines to liberation. If one wants to take one step closer to Nibbana, to enlightenment here and now, then develop a thought of loving kindness here and now. You are one step closer to enlightenment. If you want to take one step closer to enlightenment, develop a thought of compassion here and now. If you want to take one step closer to enlightenment, develop a thought of renunciation and generosity here and now. You are inclining to Nibbana. The third aspect of this path is there are forms of speech which are an expression of the mind, which one should abandon, and other forms of speech that one should cultivate. The forms of speech that one should abandon are speech which is untruthful. If one is seeking truth, then one has to develop truthfulness in one's speech. Forms of speech which are abusive or harsh to listen to. Forms of speech which are slanderous or gossiping, causing pain to others. Or forms of speech which are frivolous. If one is seeking truth, then one has to be very high-minded and speak what is worthy to hear about. And the forms of speech that the Buddha encourages to develop, and he says in the suttas, very beautiful, he says, one should develop that speech which is pleasing to listen to, that is gentle, kind, which goes to the heart of the listener, which is truthful, which is ennobling. These are the forms of speech to encourage and develop within oneself and cultivate and make much of. And this inclines towards Nibbana. If one says a kind word motivated by a kind intention, then you are one closer towards enlightenment on this gradual path of the Buddha. Then the Buddha said that there are forms of behaviour which take one away from liberation and cause pain to oneself, increase one's own dukkha, and increase others' dukkha, and there are forms of behaviour which free one from dukkha. And they are to kill is to increase one's own pain and the pain of others. To take what is not given is to increase one's own pain and as well as others. To have abuse in one's sexual relationships, that causes oneself pain and pain to others. And to take drugs and intoxicants which confuse the mind is taking one away from clarity, taking one away from truth, and is a self-destructive behaviour, which is an expression of discontentment. And these forms of behaviour are the forms of behaviour which one abandons, and one cultivates the opposite: harmlessness, non-violence, generosity and sharing, honesty and trustfulness in one's sexual relationships, and clarity and knowledge within the mind, not seeking escapism in drugs and intoxicants, which confuse and delude the mind. And then the Buddha said, if one does that, one is inclining towards Nibbana. Then the next aspect, that is the right action, then the Buddha said that there is certain forms of livelihood for one's survival in the world, which increases pain within oneself and pain to others. Those are livelihoods which are exploitive. For example, livelihoods which involve killing other beings, killing animals, for example. livelihoods which are involved in paying for other creatures, for example, having a livelihood involved in the weapons industry, producing guns, poisons, traps, things which are used in a way which is destructive to life. So one is taking moral responsibility about and concerning the way one lives and how that affects other beings in the world. Because this is an expression of compassion, this is an expression of loving kindness. If we have compassion and loving kindness for other beings, then we're not going to have a livelihood which is going to be based in causing destruction, causing pain. We're going to be sensitive to the existence of other creatures and realize the interdependence, that our happiness is very much interdependent on other people's happiness. And we see that, don't we? Especially, say, just in family life. If other people in the household are happy, then it tends to make us happy. Sometimes one person in the household is upset, it can upset the whole household. So there is this very intense interdependence of human existence, and that works on a micro level and a cosmic level. So we actually are becoming very sensitive to the way we live in the world, and very delicate in the way we live in the world. And then the Buddha said that there is a way of developing energy which will incline oneself towards enlightenment. And the energy and effort that one will take one towards enlightenment is the energy to encourage what is good and make the mind rise up and do what is good, to do a kind act, to say a kind word, to think a kind thought. And the energy and effort to overcome the opposite when unwholesome thoughts of mind, unwholesome tendencies of speech arise or unwholesome actions arise, then to realize that and stop one, to put the brake on, realizing that that takes one away from happiness, leads to pain, leads to dukkha to oneself and others, and takes one away from nibbana, to final release and happiness. And then, if one develops that, then you'll find that it leads to the next aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the mindful awareness. Mindfulness, being centered, being a person who is centered and peaceful, mindfully aware of what one is doing, what one is saying, and what one is thinking. That leads to knowledge and clarity and understanding, a precision of mind. This is this centeredness. And an indicator of a lack of mindfulness is forgetfulness and also a sense of imbalance. If you, say, stand up and tend to lose your balance, that is usually an indicator. If it's not physiological, it is usually an indicator that you're actually not mindful of what you're doing at the present moment. You're thinking about, say, where you're going or what you're doing. You're thinking ahead of yourself and are not actually in the present moment. So a person who is unmindful will tend to lose their balance, to wobble, both physically, because the mind is already wobbling. It is not centered. It is not stable, it is not still. And that is what mindful awareness does. It leads to stability of the mind. It leads to right concentration of the mind. The mind becomes focused, becomes stable, it becomes confident, it becomes powerful, and it becomes peaceful. And that level of peacefulness goes to many subtle levels. And so this is very generally a description of the path. And these 8 aspects of what we call the Noble Eightfold Path, if one develops them consistently, purposefully, and over a constant period of time, then one sees that it does incline to leading away from dukkha, away from pain, mental stress, and more towards peace. And so these 4 noble truths that the Buddha taught, that is, the cause of our problem in human existence, from the coarsest level of pain and suffering up to the most subtle level of dissatisfaction in the mind, discontentment. And the cause of that suffering being in craving, craving for sense pleasure, craving for existence, craving for non-existence. That can all be brought to an end, which is enlightenment, Nibbana. And the ending of this dissatisfaction is something that can be cultivated, developed. And the way to develop it is through the Noble Eightfold Path, the developing of right view, developing of right thought, developing of right speech, right action, right livelihood, right energy, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And that is what needs to be developed. And so when I began this talk on the Buddha's teaching of 4 Noble Truths, which he realized on the night of his enlightenment and taught, and all those people who have become enlightened since that teaching have become enlightened because they've realized these very 4 things, not because of something else. And that is why the Buddha said that dukkha has to be known, and that is why the Buddhist path is a path of knowledge. You have to know, am I suffering? Am I discontent here and now? And the cause of dukkha has to be abandoned. Ask yourself, what do I want? Or what do I don't want? That craving, that thirst, that desire is what causes dissatisfaction. And the ending of dukkha is to be realized. That is the freedom from imperfection, liberation, peace, serenity, is to be experienced and realized here and now. And the path to that liberation, the path to enlightenment, is to be cultivated through the development of the Noble Eightfold Path. So I will end this talk this evening with that, the discourse on the 4 Noble Truths. Thank you. Generally, we ask if there's any questions or comments that you may have. If anyone has anything that they want to ask on the talk, you're most welcome to. If at the point of death there is no craving, that is, craving is totally annihilated, then one will not take any rebirth. One will enter in Nibbana, what's called the Parinirvana, the final enlightenment. But if you mean by the question, if at the point of death then the coarser forms of craving and coarser forms of desire are subservient or pushed aside, then what form of rebirth one would take, then you'll find that you'll take a rebirth on a subtle level, more subtle plane. Rebirth in Buddhism, for those who don't know, occurs after death, and the Buddha actually said that there is no in-between stage, it occurs automatically after death. That one will take rebirth according to, firstly, one's action in this life and in past lives, and also according to the habitual actions in this past life, or the heavy actions in this life, or the last thought moment. And that is why in Buddhism a great stress is actually put on the quality of life at the time of death. You'll find in Buddhist countries people will tend to avoid using, say, heavy drugs on the patient when they're about to die, so they actually die with mindfulness and clarity rather than in a stupor of a drug-inflicted stupor, because that is actually detrimental for their rebirth. That is why when a person is dying, you should never cry, actually, or show grief and sorrow, because that will lead to attachment. The person's last sense faculty to pass away, apart from the mind, is actually the hearing. So even though they may not be able to speak anything, or open their eyes, or move their arms, they frequently can still hear. When the hearing goes, then that's usually the sign that that person's body will break up, and then it's just left the mind. So one doesn't show any grief, and in traditional Buddhist countries, what they would do was actually say, encourage the dying person to establish mindfulness, awareness, to reflect on what good they have done in this life. Because to actually remember acts of goodness is very important. Because if you die with, say, regret, remorse, or sadness at leaving loved ones behind, then that is a form of clinging to the world which one has to leave. And that will pull the mind back. But if one reflects on the acts of goodness, the acts of kindness that one has done, and we have all done acts of kindness, to consciously bring that forth is actually food and encouragement to do further acts of goodness. To reflect on that frequently is important. And to then establish mindful awareness and concentration of the mind at the time of death leads to clarity and purity of the mind. The mind will not be disturbed by unwholesome qualities of the mind. There will not be, say, aversion or greed or delusion in the mind. One will die with clarity, and they'll die peacefully. And just on that, if you're around a dying person, don't take what the body is doing as necessarily a sign of what the mind is doing. Sometimes physiologically the body can actually be convulsing or reacting, but that's purely a physiological reaction of, say, the nervous system. But the mind can be perfectly at peace if that mind has been trained. So it's not necessarily so that the person, say, who dies convulsing actually has had a bad death as such, or an unpleasant death. It is actually what happens in the mind. And so it's very important that the last thought moment is actually something that we prepare for. And the way to prepare for our last moment of existence is actually by developing certain habitual patterns of behavior of the mind here and now. If we incline the mind to think wholesome thoughts, purposely arousing the thought of loving kindness, then we'll develop that mental habit pattern. And when the last thought moment arises, we will die unconfused. There will be joy in the mind. There will be happiness in the mind. There will be concentration in the mind. And therefore the rebirth after that will be a wholesome rebirth, either in the human realm, or in one of the higher heaven realms, or in the higher heaven realms, the Brahmalokas. But for the fully enlightened person, and one can become enlightened at the point of death, at the moment of death. Many people at the time of the Buddha practiced meditation for many years, and actually didn't get any results. But at the time of death, because the mind realized that they were going to die and gave up attachment to the body and put an end to all craving for existence, at that point in time they became enlightened. So don't be despondent. Yes. There's hope. Because the mind is a conditioned organ. If we're creating the right conditions, then the fruit must occur. And that is why Ajahn Chah used to always give the simile of Dhamma practice, or practice of goodness and wholesomeness. The Noble Eightfold Path is like planting a tree. The duty of the practitioner is to plant the tree and look after the tree, to water the tree, to fertilize the tree, to pull the weeds up, to look out for the insects. But it's not our duty to sit there and say, when is the apple tree going to produce apples? I want apples today. I want to eat ripe apples today. The tree will actually mature and produce flowers first. Then those flowers will produce buds. And those buds produce green apples. And gradually they ripen and produce ripe apples. And then eventually, according to its own time, those ripe apples will drop off. And that is the way the Buddhist path is. The Buddha said that enlightenment is not a sudden thing. He compared it not like the sinking of a ship. When a ship sinks, it goes down very quickly. He compared enlightenment to like the gradual inclination of the seashore as it goes deeper out into the ocean. It gradually inclines away from the shore and gets deeper and deeper. So as one develops the path, develops a wholesome states of mind, wholesome states of speech, wholesome states of action, then one inclines towards the depth and profundity of enlightenment. One gradually becomes enthused or seeped in light, in wisdom, in knowledge, in Dhamma, in truth. And at the time of death, that's when one sees the fruit, the results of the practice. And especially for people who have had a near-death experience. You may have been meditating for a long time and then suddenly have a near-death experience. And it's then that you actually see the fruit of those many, many years of meditation. And a friend of mine, a lay person who I know who lives in Melbourne, just recently was telling me he's been practicing meditation for a long time, and he was starting to wonder, what are the results? Very recently he was in a car accident, and the car hit a tree smashed down, and as this process was going on, it all slowed down, of course, and he started automatically meditating and just letting go. And just allowing, if the body was going to die, just allow it to be. Just allow whatever was going to happen. And his mind immediately went into a state of composure and concentration and was completely serene and peaceful and was willing to accept whatever happened. And he survived unscathed, actually. In the car there was 3 or 4 people. Because he immediately relaxed, he was actually the one that was least injured. The other people had a lot of bruising. The other thing was, he said he saw the benefit of all those years of meditation at that one time. And sometimes we don't actually realize just how deep this on the subconscious level this training has taken effect until situations like that arise. I think that's probably enough this evening. Some people have other questions, you can maybe come and speak with me personally. I'll ask Jill to give the announcements.
Thank you. Excuse me. Ajahn Nyanadhammo, it's really very nice to have you giving us a talk. It's something that I know everybody here has really very much enjoyed, and we hope we have the chance to have more talks. Thank you. Just a few announcements. A reminder again that on July the 9th is the entry to the rains. This is a very important day down at the monastery. It's a time, for those of you who don't know, where we actually mark the beginning of a 3-month retreat that the Sangha have, and that is held at the monastery in Serpentine, and it begins with a morning program. A program will be up on the notice board in a week or so. A week prior to that, that's on Saturday the 1st of July, there's an opportunity for all of us to go down to the monastery and to help with some work that's needed to be done down there. Some very nice work, as Ajahn Nyanadhammo was saying tonight, is that they're looking for some people to help plant trees, which I think is something that we all enjoy doing, and be able to sort of see the beauty that will come from those trees over the years. The beginning part of that busy bee will be around midday, after the meal, after dana. And again, for those of you who are not familiar with the routine down there, if you'd like to go down in the morning, it's an opportunity, if you wish to take some food down to offer to the monastic group down there, to the sangha. The meal is actually held about 10:30, and if you'd like to take food before going to the busy bee, then that would be a very nice thing to do. And if you'd like to also just join in at that time, if you'd like to be down at the monastery at midday on Saturday the 1st of July. If you're uncertain as to where it is, we do have some brochures about the monastery that are at the reception desk, and in fact we even have a map, so you won't get lost either. It's a lovely place to go. Also, to let you know that about a year or 18 months ago, there was a series of talks that were given here. Most of them were given by Ajahn Jagaro, and they're called the Essentials of Buddhism. They were held over 10 weeks, and a very good systematic series of talks about exactly that, the essentials of Buddhism. What we have done now is copy those tapes and package them up into tapes, the whole series, and they're available for sale in the library at $25. It's a terrific opportunity for you to be able to listen to those talks in the pleasure and the leisure of your own home. The kettle's boiling over at the house, and after we've paid our respects to the Buddha, Dhamma and the Sangha, I hope you'll come across there and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and meet with some other Dhamma friends, and perhaps use the library facilities as well. Thank you.